I think if your intuition tells you I'm made for bigger and better things, I'm made for something that's more authentically me. I've been, conforming. I've been making myself small to fit in for a long time. I really encourage you to go back to who you were, as much as you can remember before society put all these labels and expectations on you, as much as you possibly can. Try and connect with who you were before there were all these labels put on you. Like, what's your happy place, right? And go there and try and find ways to activate and cultivate that in your day-to-day.
Hi, I'm Shannon Huffman-Polson, and I want to welcome you to Facing the Wind, Season 2 of the Grit Factor podcast. We are going to have a great time this season with episodes bringing you experts from around the world in leadership, grit, resilience, purpose, and storytelling. I've listened to you over this last year, your comments, your responses, your conversations, your questions, and this really is a season that has been designed with you in mind. This really is a season that's been designed to answer those questions that you need to know in order to fulfill that mission that I know we have in common, that mission of the Grit Institute, which is building courageous leaders for a better world. We're doing that through our courses online at thegritinstitute.com, through our books, and of course, through this podcast. And if you have a question you'd like to have included, please head over to thegritinstitute.com/podcasts and leave your voicemail. It may be included on a future episode. Meanwhile, head over to your favorite podcasting platform and hit subscribe. Then go over to YouTube and hit subscribe as well. We'll be posting the uncut interviews over at YouTube. And of course, follow along at Shannon H. Polson and the Grit Institute on Instagram and at LinkedIn. I can't wait to see you for this season. You don't want to miss a single episode. A number of years ago, Ruchika and I met at the rehearsal for a Seattle Ignite event. And it's been just fantastic to stay connected and watch her trajectory ever since. I'm so grateful to welcome her on to Facing the Wind, where we talk about diversity and leadership. Ruchika is a passionate advocate and speaker for amplifying the voices of women in the workplace. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Time, and Bloomberg, among other publications. Most recently, she's been a guest of Brene Brown's and contributed to BigThink. Diversity is key to a company's success and bottom line, and yet women are leaving the workforce in higher numbers than ever before. That's one of many reasons this conversation is so important. In this episode, we'll discuss the difference in personality and behavior that takes place before and after the ego is developed. We'll also talk about ways society has trained us to rely solely on others' expectations and how to break that mentality. Ruchika's 2 books are titled Inclusion on Purpose, An Intersectional Approach to Creating a Culture of Belonging at Work, and The Diversity Advantage, Fixing Gender Inequity in the Workplace. As we get started, why not hit subscribe to be sure you never miss an episode? And remember to leave a review. It helps others find us. Just recorded a couple of interviews. One of them is live, and the other one's not yet live, with a couple of fighter pilots, one from the UK and one from here. And that was of course a topic of conversation. Is what did you think about Top Gun? So what did you think about Top Gun? That's the question.
Did I think about Top Gun? I wanted to not like it, so I went in. I literally so it's a cool story. My mom was visiting from Singapore, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, the new Top Gun movie comes out. The original was so special for me, and can we go? Can you take me?" So I took her to the IMAX version, here in the Pacific Science Center, and it had it's like it hadn't even been open for 2 years. I don't think I hadn't seen a movie in the theater for over 2 years. And I wanted to hate it. Like, I went in being like, only here for my mom. And I was mesmerized. It was so mesmerizing. And, I have to say, there are a lot of things that I, criticize and feel like cynical about, especially in the work I do in, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes you're like, ugh, and this time in the world. But for those, whatever it was, 2 hours, I was so mesmerized. I was so excited. It was nice to see the diversity of the cast, especially, having a female pilot, obviously, a lot of racial diversity compared with the original.
Yeah.
And yeah, it felt nice, and brought to mind sort of, yeah, again, a lot of what we talk about from a leadership standpoint, collaboration and having each other's backs and psychological safety and taking risks. So yeah.
Exactly.
Anyway, I'll shut up. I thought it was awesome.
No, I
but
think it's great. We can
what did you think?
feel free to pull it through all you like through this whole conversation. No, I thought it was great. I went in with expecting it to be highly mediocre, and I would have loved it at a mediocre level. And to some degree, I think it sort of met that standard. But the flying was really fun, and I think there are parts of it that were filmed in the North Cascades, which is where we live,
right?
And so which is pretty fun as well. There were some ridiculous pieces in terms of being realistic, but that's okay.
I was asking, from a technical standpoint, I assume there were things that were just absolutely impossible. I bet.
Right. No, it's and of course I flew helicopters and not F-18s, but I have since interviewed one F-18 pilot whose interview will be part of your season, and talked to another one, and I think that technically it pushed the bounds of reality, but it's a movie, it's supposed to do that. And so I love that you're coming in from because I loved, of course, that Phoenix was there, that there's a female pilot, because that representation matters. And I love that you are coming in from that lens of, hey, let's see how this holds up to the work that you do. And that's actually an important question and conversation, besides what does an F-18 actually do, is like, okay, how did this demonstrate where we are in the world, or where we should be in the world, right?
You're so right. And actually, I mean, without a doubt, movies play such a big part, and especially for, that age, when you would probably start making that decision. I don't know how what's your journey in terms of what age you made the decision to begin flying. But I would assume, for folks I've talked to, mostly men, and we know that especially even commercial aviation, as well as all others, are very much geared towards men. I wonder what the age is, and I wonder if you seeing female representation at like 11, 12, 13 could completely change the trajectory of your life. I bet it would.
Yeah. No, I'm hopeful that it would. I mean, I know there's a number of us who are women who were inspired, even though there weren't women in the first movie, and I would have been beside myself if there wasn't a woman in this movie. But clearly Phoenix held her ground, which was great.
She did. She was awesome.
So in any event, tell us a little bit, and I will have, the listeners will have heard your introduction before this conversation, but tell us a little bit about your own journey, not necessarily the Top Gun journey, but
yes,
but Tulshan journey, and how did you get into the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, the Ruchika Tulshan journey is actually one that's I would say that it's not very linear, in the sense that a lot of where I am today has come as a result of unlearning a lot of what I was brought up to believe. And that's why, even when I opened with Top Gun and even talk about Phoenix and talking about representation, I grew up in a very traditional family, an Indian family in Singapore, where a lot of what was modeled to me and a lot of what I believed my place in the world was to sort of take a back seat, not really think about having a career, spending all my sort of energy with family and raising a family, getting married, all of those things. So it really has been a real surprise, and in many ways, the manifestation of my dreams. And this is uncomfortable for me to talk about, but we're talking about grit, and you are the world expert on grit.
Oh, well.
and I actually have to say that, because, for listeners who don't know, I don't know if we'll talk about this in any other place, but Shannon, I met you the first time. Talk about serendipity. I met you the first time in 2015 that I had ever been on a public stage.
It's amazing.
having and I gave a 5-minute presentation. In fact, before yours, I think it was Shannon. On I talked about the lack of gender diversity in the workplace and what organizations could do. And I think I got into that Ignite format because my title of the talk was hiring more women isn't rocket science or something like that, right?
It was great.
And it
It was great.
and I
You were
and it was
great.
the first. Thank you for saying that, but it was the first time, and for me, it was a real, I really had to push myself out of my comfort zone to do that and to get comfortable with saying like, okay, I kind of know what I'm talking about and I've done the research and it's okay for me to be the person, taking up space. And I'll never forget being so inspired by seeing you. Well, of course, we met beforehand and in the rehearsals. I remember watching you in rehearsals and in many ways being mesmerized in the same way, because I'll always remember how your presentation lit up, right? And it was what was the way that, do you remember, I mean, you do so many presentations, but do you remember how like one, as you made a point, each point would light up? I assume something to do with flying, right?
Well, sort of. I mean, it was sort of also like the Ignite format is so interesting, right? Because it's these like, for people who don't know, it's these, you have your slides advance automatically every 20 seconds for 5 minutes, which is sort of crazy. And as I was developing it, it was sort of this idea of like, okay, what would all these be? And I was like, well, why not just sort of hack the whole idea and just have it be sort of like this, almost like a timer, right? And
Yeah.
a point would come up, and then 20 seconds later, another point would come up, and it went around the clock. And yeah, no, it was just sort of a fun way to play with the format and play with the ideas and have it come full circle, right?
Come full circle, which is exactly. And when I saw, and I remember seeing your presentation, just being so excited by the idea, like you can learn resilience and grit, and you can take the adversity you've seen and experienced and really channel it to do good in the world, right? And to
Yes.
inspire others to do good in the world. And I didn't have words and I didn't have the language to say like, hey, this is what I want to do. But seeing a few others on stage that day, and then really getting deeper and deeper into my own research around first, gender equity in the workplace, and then, certainly now extending that beyond just gender and just really talk about true inclusion and belonging for everyone who has experienced marginalization. It really started from there, getting comfortable with using my voice, getting comfortable with sharing my ideas, and talking about, and unlearning those messages of like, your voice doesn't matter, what you're saying, the way you think, nobody's interested. And you hear that, I heard that certainly in where I grew up, and some of the ideas and sort of the narratives I saw there. But
Right.
I have to say, the corporate world, which, and I've heard the militaries like this as well. The corporate world is very good at reminding women, especially women of color, what's your place, and that you should stay in your place and stay in your lane. And I think that challenging that narrative, building resilience because you've faced that adversity, that grit of, getting knocked down and getting up again, is so much a part of the story.
Yeah, and I love how you're describing this as the cultural narrative, both that many of us, probably frankly most of us, grow up with, right? As well as the cultural narratives within the context of a larger organization. To be honest, the grit that is required to overcome those daily and in the moment and constant reminders of that narrative, and that constant kind of putting you in your place, right, is I think, in a sense, the most difficult sort of grit to be able to both foster and to be able to call upon, as opposed to like, okay, we can train for a marathon, you can run a marathon, the marathon is done, now you decide what you want to train for next, right? And that's one thing, and that certainly requires plenty of it, and there are many examples like that. But the terms, some of these terms sometimes I think get used to a place where people start to tune them out. But I've sort of keyed in on this like microaggressions, right? And microaggressions are real. And when it happens, 100 times in the course of a day in little ways, that takes a certain kind of grit. So how How do you think in your own story that you were able to either draw on past experiences or develop new perspectives so that you could find that grit that you need to get through those times?
I want to say something, and I actually would love because see, this is the journalist in me, and I'm
Yeah,
super fascinated by your story. Also, because I very unfortunately don't know very many women who've had the amazing experience that you've had. But I have to say that a lot of the career and even just life in general achievements that that I'm obviously very proud of, and I think of the courage it takes for the work that you have done in your life, as much as there was there were setbacks and there was moments of adversity and all of that, and of course you have to train hard and you have to work hard and all of that. Nothing really honestly helped me develop grit, and really some of the biggest challenges I faced in my life are kind of more interpersonal. They
yeah,
are more those, what you said, whether you call it microaggressions or biased behaviors, or the constant
yeah,
reminder that you don't belong, that you are overlooked and underestimated and talked over and
sure.
expected to conform, and given daily reminders,
Right.
sometimes hourly reminders that, hey, you should just stay in your place. For me, I would say that is a much bigger, those are much bigger hurdles that I feel like I've had to overcome,
Yes.
rather than, training for this big thing or launching a book or
Yes.
speaking on a stage, or I don't know for you, flying. Can speak for you on that, but truly, and then it's and in the work I've done since, I've been so lucky. I've spoken at organizations like NASA, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, spoken to women engineers there, and women, truly rocket scientists there. And you realize that across the board, across the world, there are people doing amazing work. And the biggest barrier that people face if they don't find themselves represented are constantly having to face those aggressions in many ways daily, and constant reminders. And then how do you
Yes.
develop beyond that and channel that? And in many ways I feel really lucky, right? Like I had experiences that were really hard, and I remember feeling like I was leaping into the abyss. Actually, again, serendipitously, the time we met, in 2015 when I met you,
Yeah.
I had left corporate America for less than a year, and I didn't know what I was doing next. I had a book coming out, which was, it was sort of a much smaller sort of book and launch than what my second book has been. And I hadn't written for a long time. Like I hadn't written for big publications. I had written for Forbes, but it wasn't like Harvard Business Review.
Sure.
And it was it was really a moment of like, do I let those voices in my head that have developed as a result of constantly hearing you're not good enough and you don't belong, do I let them win, or do I let the voice that says there's no path yet and you may not be able to see what it looks like, but you've got to have that faith and you've got to channel the
Yes.
challenges that you've faced. And it was a constant struggle, and again, adding more nuance and layer and complexities, whether it was being an immigrant. I am an immigrant to the United States, whether it's coming from a very traditional culture where generally, from especially from my culture specifically, women don't really work outside the home, being the first, right? So never seeing a role model of like a working mother who looked like me.
Yes.
And like all of these things, that confluence of it has in many ways led me to this moment.
Yeah, and as you talk about it, and I think that we have not obviously not all the same parallels, but some similarities in terms of family values and certain aspects of cultural values. I know some are quite different as well, but as I think about what we talk about as the grit triad in the grit factor, right? We have commit, learn,
Mhm.
and launch, and commit is owning your past, and
Yes.
that's important, even if that means overcoming aspects of that past, right, and launching off of that. But what I feel like you're describing so well is in this second piece, which is like the deep engagement in the present, the learning phase, right? And there's building your team, there's active listening. You're obviously great at that. You're a journalist by training. But then the mindset piece, which I used to think was really squishy and not really like it. And now I'm like, it is that belief, that belief in the end, even if you don't really know what that end is, even if you know it's a direction, even if you know it's about an action in a direction, which you might change, but there's a belief in something that is bigger or that is different or that is more authentically who you are and how you're meant to show up and contribute meaningfully in the world, right?
Absolutely. And I think, again, for so many of us who don't hear it or don't see it, it's easy to fall, and it makes sense, right? I never want to tell women, you're not doing enough, or you're not trying hard enough, or you're not confident enough, or blame, women for not succeeding. But we, at some point, we have to say, okay, this is a system. We may have faced challenges of, many things being stacked against us. And how do we draw that resilience and that grit factor to move ahead?
Yes. And so for those people who are at any stage of their careers, because I think you can do this kind of thoughtful interrogation of your own life and experience at any point, and you should, right? At many points, at certainly any transition points. It may inspire a transition, it may be in the midst of a transition. But that mindset of knowing and believing in the end, even if you don't know what that is, what would you say to somebody who's like, I can't be constrained by either this organizational, these parameters here, or this cultural value that's here, but I don't know what it is that I'm supposed to do. What do you say to somebody like that? Because I think there are a lot of people in that place.
This is really interesting. So as I spent some time, in introspection about how I got to where I am. And I think we don't talk enough about, which is why when you talk about the grit triad, I really like the first part, which is commit, right?
Yeah.
And I think when I think about commit, what has happened to me, or what came very clear to me in the last few years as I began writing more, both for HBR and the New York Times, and working on the book, and just basically speaking more and getting my words out more, is I actually was always like this. There was a part of me, there was, the Ruchika who's 5 and 6 and 8 years old was very talkative, very expressive, very clear and articulate about what mattered to me, very committed to justice. I mean, my mom has stories of me like standing up for other kids and whatnot, and giving a lot of advice. And then somewhere along the way, I lost that in some way. Somewhere along the way, I wanted to conform to, oh, but I should get a career in this. Oh, this is what, good girls do. This is the way I should behave. This is, I shouldn't be, I shouldn't be heard. And in fact, in many ways, not even seen. Like it should just be, I'm behind the scenes. Right. And there was a part of me that fell prey to that. And now what brought me back, when we think about commit and like unlearning and, accepting and learning from your past, it's for people who are sure, like there's a deep intuition in you. And, we call it women's intuition. In all honesty, research from Dr. Therese Houston, a colleague at Seattle University, shows, women, we all have intuition, and it is not based on emotion. It's actually based on data. It's based on your track record, right? And women are very attuned to it because that is how we have been socialized and rewarded to be, even though, again, corporations and even society tells us like, oh, women are too emotional and like, we don't make good decisions. We actually do, as her research shows.
Yes.
But I think if your intuition tells you I'm made for bigger and better things, I'm made for something that's more authentically me. I've been, conforming. I've been making myself small to fit in for a long time. I really encourage you to go back to who you were, as much as you can remember, before society put all these labels and expectations on you, as much as you possibly can. And I think you'll start to see, like I think of myself in, as a writer and speaker, but I always was from the moment I was really young. Yes. And I look at my sister, who's 3 years younger, and as from a really young age, she was really artistic and very interested in art, and found her passion through that, and right. I tell her she should be an artist, and she's like, no, like she's a great interior designer, and of course that art has served her well. Right. But I think she should be an artist. And I remember those days. Right. So my advice is to people, I'm rambling a bit, but my advice is really to try and connect with who you were before there were all these labels put on you. Like, what's your happy
Yes.
place, right? And go there and try and find ways to activate and cultivate that in your day to day.
That's such good advice. It's I think they call it depth psychology, where you go back and you look at the place where you were before your ego kicks in, and your ego that is informed by society, right? Before it says, "Hey, you
Right.
should be a doctor or a lawyer," which is great if you want to be that. But and it's it's funny too, Rashiko, as you say this, because people will say, "Oh my gosh, my first book was North of Hope, and it came out in my 30s," and they're like, "Well,
Yes.
how did you suddenly start writing?" I was like, "Suddenly, I've been writing my entire life. Like this has
Yes.
been part of my entire life has been writing, and it's just." The publishing is a new thing, but the writing is not a new thing. And the speaking, I go back to that the most important class I had in high school was debate. I mean, I loved
Wow.
debate. I was great at it. It was my thing. And on top of sports, and it all just it comes around. If you start to live into who it is that you really are, that not that the world is telling you should be or your family is telling you should be, but who it was that you're made to be, right? And how you're made to show up in the world. It's powerful.
It really is. I lost you for a little bit, but yes,
Yeah,
you're so
yeah.
right. And I
Sorry
think
about that.
I think the more of us who really, because now when I think about, the level of pain I see in the world, the amount of disconnect based on a variety of different factors, we're more polarized than we've ever been right now. I think it comes down to so many of us living in pain, and B, not truly as our authentic selves, as the selves that we were meant to be,
Yes.
right? And I feel really lucky. Unfortunately, in a capitalist society, there's a tremendous amount of privilege that you need to have to be able to then say that this is the work I'm doing, or this is what I'm doing that gives me purpose and joy. And
Right.
for me, I can see I show up so much better for myself, certainly, and others, because I get to do that every day. In many ways, I get to live the life that I have created and designed, and very much built on the grit I've developed in all these years where I wasn't really living my authentic life.
Well, and talk a little bit about that, because I want to get to your book that's out now as well. But when you got to that stage in 2015 and you've left a job where you're not happy, or I'll let you speak to that for sure. But what there's an amazing amount of energy that's required initially to make a decision, to make a
Mm.
change, to employ the grit that may have been building up in you, or that you may need to start to build, right? Because maybe
Mm.
you've lost track of it. How did you connect to that sense? And I like to use the word grit, but that sense of grit, that sense of resilience, that sense of purpose, that you are
Mm.
meant to be doing something else in a way that gave you enough energy to make that change, to step up on that stage in your case.
Oh, that's such a great question. And it's one that I don't have a great answer to. I think you certainly get to a stage in your life where, to stay tightly wound up in the bud, I'm like paraphrasing a quote, but is more painful than opening up and setting free, right? And blossoming.
Yes.
And I actually think there was some part of it, which was that my body, my mind, my soul, everything was screaming like, this is not
Right.
you are not, yes, the money's good, and yes, stock options are great, and the benefits, and it's, people, there are a whole group of people who are, who respect me because, hey, I get to say I work for so and so corporation.
Sure.
But there is something missing in me, right? I in many ways, like, to be like, not to be dramatic, but truly, like, you're living a lie. You're
Yeah.
living a life that was not meant for you.
Right.
And that if you hit check on all of these, it's time to go. I mean, I would say probably, if you had to do it that way, your body and your both your body and your mental health, but your health overall, your well-being, you're getting the signs, whether it's sleeplessness, whether it's body aches, whether it's other issues. There's a huge amount of connection between working in, workplaces that weren't designed for you, where you don't belong, that are non-inclusive,
Yes.
And health issues, variety of health issues. Women, we're dealing with record rates of heart disease and cancer and things like that. So we know there's a big part of this is physiological, like that there's something missing. And sadly many of us get very rude awakenings that way.
Yes.
And then I'd say the second is that there's a also more a physical manifestation, but that feeling of you don't want to wake up and do the thing that you're doing. And that's really because when I now in the work I do now, when I talk to women who are doing incredible things, I actually ask them, I'm like, how did you know that this was the path for you? I get curious on that all the time. And almost all of them will say some variation of, I look forward to every day. I look forward to every day. Some variations, some are like, I wake up and I'm so excited and, I don't even need coffee. That's not me. I need my coffee.
No, me too.
But, yeah. But there's some version of like, I am living this amazing life and I feel so lucky and ready. And if you don't feel that way, there is something missing. There clearly is. And then the third is probably the third factor that probably makes sense for you to think about, if you're thinking of leaving, is actually if even when you face people, I mean, I faced people certainly as an immigrant woman here, like, hey, are you sure you want to leave a corporate job? You sure you want to leave the benefits and the high salary and this, that, and the other? And in my mind, even when I would sway, even when I was like, oh man, like, what does it mean to leave behind a really, a big job? And then, no, but I really need to. Oh no, but like, I'll lose my health insurance, but oh no, but I really can't stay here anymore. And that I would like oscillate between yes and no. And eventually the voice in my head that said, no, you have to leave would like it eventually drowned out all the voices, even like to the last day when I was like going to hand in my resignation. There were members of my extended family that were like, are you sure this is, like, why would you leave a great job?
Right.
And I just, and I couldn't articulate it, but I was like, I need to go.
Yeah, that sounds so familiar. I remember,
yes.
I mean, we're both in Seattle, I know, and I remember leaving my last corporate job, and it was a great company, and it was with a great team, and all of those things were great. I can say nothing but good things about the company if you want to work at a company, right? And every time somebody would say, where do you work? What do you do? And I would feel embarrassed. And it was a great job. And I was like, what is, I mean, but because I wasn't, at some point you get old enough to say, this isn't true to who I am. And so there needs to be a way to show up in the world. I mean, I learned a lot, and I still have very good friends from there. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity and everything I learned. But and was able to contribute both of those things, right? I always tell people not to leave until you've learned something significant and you've contributed something significant. And you can feel good about choices at that point. But but it was time to do something that felt like, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be, doing what I'm supposed to do in the way I'm supposed to do it, versus fitting into some kind of a parameter that is meant for somebody else and a different kind of.
Do you feel, sorry, that's amazing. Do you feel like that right now? Do you feel like you're doing what you were meant to do?
I do, to some degree. I mean, there's always something in every job that is that you've got to do for some part of the business, right? And you and I are now
taxes. I'm like thinking of taxes.
No, absolutely. I feel like I am finally, and I turned 50 this year. I'm like, I'm where I'm supposed to be, and I have my plans out. I know. I don't
believe that. That's hard to believe.
So I bring decades of experience, Ruchika, to this conversation.
Oh, yes.
No, it's good. It's so no, I do. I feel exactly like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, and you do need to continue to interrogate that, right? And say, is there a slight direction change? Is it okay if I explore a little bit over here? Because that's part of also making what I give to my clients more authentic and better. And I think that's just part of what we all need to do. And actually, one of my bosses at Microsoft at one point said, you should write your resume every year and look around and decide, like, hey, is this still where I'm meant to be? Then great. And if it's not, then go apply for something else. But you're making an informed choice to be where you are. And I think that's a great recommendation, no matter where you're working. So
I feel that so much, Shannon, because I think the hardest, most painful feeling that I can remember is feeling like I was playing like a guest appearance in my own life,
yeah,
right? And living a life where you're like, am I really, is it really my life?
right.
Or am I just going through the motions? Am I on autopilot, to continue the,
Yeah.
the Top Gun sort of, but are you living the type of life that you are choosing and
Yes.
intentionally choosing by design? Or are
Yeah.
you just fitting into a mold that someone else created for you that doesn't actually really fit?
Yes, absolutely. And that feels like that should be an easy question, but it's not if you've been doing something else for so long, right? And it really requires thoughtful introspection and careful consideration. Yeah, that's why that commit phase is so important. That's the deep
Mm,
internal work before you can go out and do anything else that connects to anyone else, right? Yeah, that's
yes.
well, let's talk a little bit about with all of that work that you've done, that incredible background that you have as an immigrant, as a woman of color, as Ruchika, right? I mean, you're just this incredible person that has made these incredible choices that I had the incredible
Thank
opportunity
you.
to meet so many years ago. So talk about Inclusion on Purpose, your newest book.
Yeah. So inclusion on purpose is also well, I have to say a couple of things, right? So one of the things that I think was very key in the making of inclusion on purpose is I didn't know that that was a book I should write or I wanted to write. And
Yes.
actually being seen
Uh,
because of an article I wrote for Harvard Business Review by an agent, Miley Beale, who has just launched, her own agency. She's co-founded an agency called Arc Literary. So I just wanted to
love
Arc
it.
Literary Management, give her a little call out. But she reached out to me and she just said, "Hey, I read this article about corporate diversity efforts, and do they impact or do they actually harm women of color? And have you ever thought about writing another book?" And I was like, "No, I haven't. I mean, no, not really." And she was like, "I really think this book needs to be out there, and I know there are books about diversity and inclusion, and I understand you don't want to just add to the noise,
Yeah.
and I think you have a really unique perspective." And I
Yeah.
think that's part of taking that brave step when you are leaving behind something that was safe but you've
Right.
outgrown, or maybe was never what you wanted to do but was safe. And when you kind
Yes.
of lip into when you leap into the abyss, rather, what happens in the beginning, it's really scary and you're like, wow, what did I do? Did I make the right decision? And then slowly, as you build your tribe, and it'll be a different tribe from the tribe that was your safe tribe when you were
Yes.
in doing the safe things, right? When you're doing the brave things, your tribe has to change. And in the
Yes.
beginning, you may not find them. They may not, it's not like they're waiting there, or maybe you yourself haven't articulated what you need. So
Yes.
you're out there and you're like, "I'm so lonely and I don't know if this was the right thing." And the people in your old tribe are continuing to live the safe life that you left behind, and they don't understand you. And you're
So
kind of
true.
you're feeling your way. You can't see anything. It's like you're in complete darkness and you're feeling your way.
Yeah.
And then suddenly someone reaches out their hand to you and they say, "Hey, I see you and let me help lift you up." And that's what happened with Miley. So Inclusion on Purpose is truly the book that I was supposed to write so far. I feel really lucky that I got the opportunity to articulate our voices and our needs, especially the voices of Black women, can help us really create a workplace and a future, a world that we can all thrive in.
Yes.
Some of the things that I appreciate a lot, in the book process, now that I'm at this stage of it, is I had to go through a time. I shopped the book proposal right at the beginning of the pandemic in sort of April 2020. My manuscript was due in the depths of the pandemic in November 2020. And it was really painful. And to have to talk about grit, to have, at that time, my son was 3, so 3 to 4. And so to write deliver a 70,000 word manuscript in
Right.
the middle of a once in a lifetime pandemic where you don't know if you'll get sick, if others around you will get sick, are we going to die from this thing? Like there was a lot of fear,
Yeah.
and not having childcare, another huge challenge, which we know a lot of women and women leaders face,
Yes.
especially as, with young children at home. And then on top of that, having to write this book within the larger context of a racial justice movement, right? A racial reckoning that
Right.
came in May 2020. So
Yes.
there were like all these factors that made it seem again like it almost felt like I was, flying, almost like I was flying my own, fighter pilot, my
Yeah.
own fighter jet. Kind of felt a bit like that. I would imagine, not that I've ever done it. And I have to say that getting to this stage and reaching the other end of having a published book, having a book that seems to have resonated and gotten some, critical acclaim is pretty amazing. But you have to go through that really hard period to get to
Yes.
the other side.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm so glad that you did. Yeah, the timing on the last few years for any writer, well, for anyone really, right? But I mean, yeah,
Anyone.
it
Yeah.
is hard. I mean, and I understand having the young kids at home during the pandemic, and you're like, how is my brain supposed to function? How am I
Oh my
supposed
gosh.
to, right? I mean, that is, yeah. So tell us, I mean, inclusion on purpose, and you are coming at it from such an important perspective, right? From as a woman and as a woman of color, and there's the intersectionality of that is a really important
Yes.
thing to talk about.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about how it is that you approached it,
Yeah.
and how you've seen it show up in the world.
Yeah, that's a great question, Shannon. Thank you. And I will say this: what I appreciate about the sort of reception to inclusion on purpose is people understand that at its core, I come from the approach that almost everyone I've ever met, and especially people in corporations and corporate leaders, they want to do the right thing. There are great intentions. There's a whole lot of like, I want to be a good leader. I care what my people think, how they feel. I don't want to intentionally leave out anyone. I don't want to intentionally perpetuate bias. Yes, there are toxic leaders. I do, I don't want to say that people like that don't exist.
Sure.
But indeed, largely, the vast majority of people I've met and all the work I've done in all these years want to do the right thing. They often just don't know how. And
Yes.
so my approach with inclusion on purpose is to say, hey, I've made a bunch of mistakes. I've struggled my own self. I've definitely been in situations where I perpetuated bias and I made other people not feel included. And
Mm.
here's what I've learned since. Here's how learning to be uncomfortable, making mistakes, embracing failure, expecting that I needed to do my own work and expecting that change would take time. These sorts of factors are very important for us to create an inclusive environment, but it has to happen on purpose.
Yes.
Because left to our own devices, our intentions might be wonderful. It doesn't lead to good impact.
Yes. Yes, and there's so many things to pull apart in this. First of all, I love that you come at it with this very self-aware understanding of like, we've all perpetuated this problem, right? And even if we are part of the group that is being marginalized, we also have done work probably that has
Yes,
made it worse, right?
sure.
I mean, that's hard to kind of own up to, but it's also important. And I love also that you're saying that most people do want to do the right thing. But the thing that I love too is that it's inclusion on purpose, right? So you've talked about, we both have shared some shared experience, and you in a much more, I think, interesting way in your background, but have come from backgrounds where, I was told not to speak up as much. I laugh. I mean, this was clearly a point of.
I'm like, I can't even imagine, given, how much your voice carries and resonates and stay. I mean, as I said, like we met, 7 years ago, and I still remember
Yeah,
our conversations.
I
So
do too.
that's
I'm so
absurd.
grateful
It's absurd.
for this continued connection, Ruchika,
Yeah.
and I know it's going to continue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But coming from that, uh, and coming from environments and having worked in environments, and the military certainly is one where where you're kind of put in your place many times.
Mm,
In order for a culture to not just accommodate, but actually encourage people to show up
mm,
as their best selves, contribute their best. And at the end of the day, like there's
mm.
enough change and challenge in the world that we need every single person to show up as their best
Yes.
selves to contribute their absolute best, right? Every organization needs that. And to make that happen, that inclusion does have to be on purpose. I love that on purpose. So, how do we do this on purpose? How do we develop those cultures on purpose that permit everybody to show up as their best selves?
I lost you. Could you say the last part again? Just
Yeah,
that last
yeah,
part.
yeah. And I'm sorry. I think this is my,
No, it's totally
but
fine.
it will all come together. Don't worry. Yeah. So, how do we, I mean, how does an organization or a corporation, any kind of a group, how do we build a culture that allows everybody to show up and contribute their absolute best? Because we need everybody to show up and to do that.
We really do. And a couple of things. I think one is the individual awareness and responsibility. So one of the things that I talk a lot about is yes, absolutely leaders need to take an outsized responsibility to create a more inclusive environment, and indeed whether that's through their own journey and self-awareness, whether that's in committing budget and committing time and committing that intention and making inclusion a leadership priority, that's very important.
Sure.
But anyone at any stage of their career at any organization can begin, right? And where it begins is cultivating self-awareness. What are the biggest challenges that people from marginalized communities face today? What are the books that I can read? What are the podcasts I can listen to?
Yes.
This is certainly one of them. And how can I really build the muscle of understanding and empathy of what it's like for people who may have not been represented here? And I
Yes.
think when you start to do that, when you really take an immersive approach where you're not the center of the story, but you're reading someone else's story, you're watching a film, you're listening to a podcast, that's one of the very key ways that we can build empathy for people who are different than us. So there's that individual responsibility, which then from building that self-awareness and building that awareness of what bias looks like and being able to identify it, then you move into action. And action could literally be like, if you are on a, if you're on a hiring committee, making sure you understand, what are the challenges that people from underestimated communities are facing,
Sure.
and what are the ways to ensure that your, hiring pool is diverse, for example.
Yes.
So I talk about examples like that in the book. And then all the way to making sure your meetings are inclusive, making sure you're pronouncing people's names correctly, making sure you're, not misgendering someone or getting pronouns correct. All of these things, they feel like maybe if maybe you've always been represented. Oh, so what's a big deal if someone gets my name wrong? No, it's a really big deal for
Yeah.
people whose names are not that familiar or aren't, Anglo-Saxon and Westernized like myself.
Sure.
It really creates a sense of belonging and safety when I hear someone say they don't have to get it right the first time. What matters most is someone saying to me, could you please pronounce your name for me? And, what does it sound like? And then I'll say, oh, it's Ruchika. And then they will get it right. And that to me communicates respect. Like, I see you, I value you. And we can all do this at any stage. You don't again have to be the leader with the big budget. And
Yeah.
then obviously there are organizational interventions such as, making sure your hiring process is equitable, like do you pay people equally, all of that. And then I think the last part is how do we show up in society to
Mm.
be more intentional and mindful. So I think about, for example, who owns the restaurants that I frequent, who owns the bookstores that I buy from,
Yeah.
right? Like which neighborhoods do I frequent and get to know? And I think just being so much more aware and being much more intentional. Again, like if you're on autopilot, the default is to go to people who are already overrepresented, right? The majority, the easiest option, right, is to go to someone who is already in the dominant majority group, right? That's what the way society has been set up. That's the easy option. Being intentional and aware about those choices you make could sometimes mean making more effort, and it's always worth it.
Yes. So well said. So on the other side, as the individual, there's a lot of interesting data around, and there's good reasons for this, right? That women and I actually don't know the data. You will, I think, for women of color, but that risk taking can be harder. Risk taking is clearly important. It's clearly critical
Yes.
for success. But it's harder for so many reasons. And I think imposter syndrome is just sort of like the tip of the iceberg, right? It's really that we're judged much more harshly for not
Hmm.
succeeding if a risk is taken, even though failure is part of the path to success for every leader. So how, as an individual, do you think about taking those risks, knowing the judgment is harsher, knowing the data is out there against you, but it's so critical to both your own fulfillment and creative expression, but also contribution and success?
Yeah, this is such a good point. I think the point I want to underscore that you just made
Yeah.
is for a lot of people I speak to about, especially imposter syndrome or confidence, or not people, really women, people who identify as women, and then again, especially women of color. It's when we talk about imposter syndrome and confidence issues and all of that, I always say it makes sense why you feel these feelings. It makes sense, right? You are in a system, you're working in a system, operating in a system that wasn't designed for you. So
Right.
it makes sense. And I want you to feel validated. It's not like you have an inherent, and a lot of the dominant narrative for years has been, women are biologically hardwired to be like this and men
Yeah.
are biologically hardwired to be like that. It's absolutely untrue. Good research proves that actually the differences between the genders is very, very, between the sexes actually is very, very minuscule and negligent, right? And doesn't have a big bearing on how you show up inherently and how you're hardwired to show up, right? It's the way we socialize girls versus boys. And I say this because I have a boy who's going to turn 6 tomorrow, and I really see, I mean, he loves pink, and he's like, there are no pink toys designed with me in mind, for example. Or I
Sure.
love silver, or I love sparkles, or I love unicorns. And it's that gender binary is very quickly and deeply enforced. And then the way we as a society reward boys versus girls, and I know I'm speaking in terms of gender binary, but truly the way we show up and the way we reinforce and reward behaviors and punish others. So I think it's important to acknowledge that you do have these factors working against you so that you don't gaslight yourself.
Sure.
And then knowing that, again, you're back to that those two voices will be in your head, right? There's the voice that's saying like, I'm not confident, or I have imposter syndrome, or I feel really, really like I can't do this. And then there's that other voice, and really building the other voice that says, even if I fail, I need to do this to get to the other side. I
Right.
need to take this risk. I need to take the chance. And I'm going to be prepared. I'm going to be prepared that I'm going to be judged more harshly.
Yes.
What can I do to safeguard myself so that
Yeah.
even if others judge me harshly, I don't judge myself harshly. I
Yes.
don't give up on myself. And some of the ways are obviously building your own inner resilience, finding ways to really connect deeply with yourself,
Yeah.
as well as finding your tribe, finding others who will lift you up who will cheer you on as you take that risk, and will be there to lift you up if you fail.
Yes, yes. Oh, that's so well said. That's so well said. And I do love that
Thank you.
in Inclusion on Purpose, you do talk about this facing failure, right? I mean, because that is something,
Yes.
it's so hard. I mean, it just is. I mean, for all of us, for men and women, and every human has a hard time with failure. And yet it is a critical part of stretching ourselves and growing into new things and bigger things.
Absolutely. And, the funny thing is, you really have to get comfortable with failing.
Yeah.
You really do, right? If you want to live that, again, the brave life, if you want to live, there's this quote from Oprah I say again and again and again, because I actually go back and watch her saying this to Brene Brown every
Uh,
time I'm doing something that I feel like is scaring me. I'll go back to this quote, which says, you cannot live a brave life without disappointing some people.
yes.
But the good thing is, the people who really care about you they're rooting for your rise and they will not be disappointed. And the ones who are disappointed are only the ones who have their own agenda. It's not like they have your best interests at heart. And that is something for so many of us as women who have been socialized to be people pleasers. I certainly have.
Yes.
That was a big, often the fear of failure when I thought about it was less to do with, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail and I won't be able to get up again. Actually, I have a lot of confidence in myself to be able to get up again.
Sure.
It's that, oh my gosh, I'm going to disappoint someone. I'm going to fail someone's expectations of me. And I think a big part of stepping into my power has been saying, I can't live a brave life without disappointing some people.
That is a really important point. And that comes up in the Grit Factor actually in several stories, is how we are socialized to want to be liked, right? I mean, and everybody is. That's how society forms. That's how lives form. But as women in particular, if you are brought up culturally, even subtly, and subtly our culture still does this, despite the fact that we have Phoenix and Top Gun and other things, just to bring this full circle. But we still have this socialization of being a little bit in the back seat, being a little bit in the supporting role. Not being too loud, not pushing too many buttons. And there is this thing that is, and it's been some of the hardest experiences in my life, is when I have either felt like I've disappointed somebody, or else there's been some person-related challenge, right? Where even if you know that you addressed it the right way, that you worked with empathy and with integrity, there's still this piece that's just really hard to let go, right? Because we're so socialized that way. And you can even say, I did this, I gave this its consideration, its due, and yet it's a very hard thing to do. So I'm going to go look up that little episode from Between Oprah and Brene. Yes. I love that.
I'll send it to you because it captures it perfectly, right? It captures that fear that so many of us face perfectly. And again, you're so right. We all are. I mean, we're social animals, human beings, regardless of gender. And again, for women, it gets reinforced and very much rewarded to people please and placate others and feel really bad if you mess up. And for men, it actually, it really does abate. That's the point. The point is less. The point I try to make, even with the work I've done, research I've done on imposter syndrome with Jodi Ann Bury, what we find is it's less to do with, it's not that men don't have confidence issues. It's not that men don't feel imposter syndrome. In fact, research shows they do just as often as women, and they report that. Yes. The challenge is, or the difficulty where we want to create a more equal and level playing field, like truly an inclusive future, is one where your style of behaving, of showing up in the workplace, how you wear your hair, what you wear, all of those things, the way you talk, are considered just as professional, and you're rewarded just in the same way. And same with failure. You're rewarded and you are appreciated, and you have a chance to prove yourself again in the same way that men do. And that's where we're going to reach sort of the next level.
Yes. Well, that is very well put. Thank you. Well, I will ensure that show notes include obviously a link to your books. Obviously,
thank you.
Link to the Brene Brown and Oprah.
Thank you.
To ARC Literary and to all of the other good things we've talked about. Maybe even our Ignite shows. I mean, that was a while ago.
That was so long ago. But we can both have a look at how far we've come in all of these years, right? And celebrate that. We don't do that enough. We don't do that, especially in today's world. We are keep on moving. Absolutely. But there is something back to your framework of committing. You do have to look at who you are and how far you've come.
It's critically important for sure. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's so good to see you. It really is. It really is.
Good to see you. Thank you, Shannon.
That's Facing the Wind, Season 2 of The Grit Factor. Thank you for being here. As always, it's great to have you listening in. And if you enjoyed this episode, would you subscribe, leave us a review, and share with a friend? And make sure to pick up your own copy of The Grit Factor for candid stories and lessons from leaders in the vanguards of their fields. If you have a question you'd like to ask, send me a voicemail through the link at my website at thegritinstitute.com/podcast. See you next week.